I'd like to thank ASMEA for providing me with the honor of delivering this keynote address. A long time ago, longer than I wish to remember, I was a student of Fouad Ajami's at SAIS, and today he's a friend, and I must say I'm absolutely delighted to address an institution that he helped found with Bernard Lewis, who I feel I've probably known even longer. Many of us who grew up in the Middle East would read his remarkable scholarship, and I'm glad to say until not long ago we could still do so. So I'm very pleased to be here and to have been invited to this conference. Today is Lebanese Independence Day. The title of this talk is, as you probably know, The Arab Upheavals, A View from Beirut. Today is Lebanese Independence Day, and the fact that Lebanon is as little independent as it ever was from regional dynamics allows me to inject a little element of irony into this presentation. Indeed, there has been much bitter irony in the last 2 years in the Arab upheavals. They were supposed to usher in a new and more open and democratic Middle East, and a less authoritarian Middle East, because that is what populations demanding emancipation are supposed to strive for. Instead, in most cases, they have hit up against resilient systems of absolute control. To paraphrase the Sicilian writer Leonardo Sciascia, systems in good health in the sense of crime, creating situations in some cases that were, if not necessarily worse than what existed before, were also not noticeably better. I'm not suggesting that the early optimism was misplaced or wrong, and I certainly am not someone who subscribes to the view that Arab societies are somehow incapable of creating more democratic orders, or that there is some kind of cultural flaw that dooms Arabs to live under the boot of tyrants and psychopaths. Rather, I'm simply saying that the narrative has changed in the past 2 years, even in Lebanon, perhaps the first country to revolt against a criminal order in 2005 after the assassination of the former Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri. Yet it must be said that the volatile aftermath following the Syrian withdrawal from Lebanon, it inured the Lebanese to the rather naive notion that heroic narratives of emancipation must somehow end happily, or necessarily must end happily. Beirut has been an ideal vantage point to observe the changes in the region. Lebanon is a playing field for the contradictions and rivalries throughout the Middle East, and it is a place particularly adept at understanding the bitterness and tragedy at the heart of the grand endeavors that have swept the region. It is also a country intimately familiar with thwarted ambition and frustration. I'd like here, if you'll allow me, to do two things: outline the specifically Lebanese context of the past 2 years and explain how the Arab uprisings, by which in Lebanon's case I mean specifically the uprising in Syria, how it has impacted on the country. And secondly, I'll conclude by offering some general and random conclusions on the Arab uprisings as seen from Beirut. Well, the impact of the Arab uprisings on Lebanon first. Needless to say, Lebanon has been affected most by the situation in Syria. It has taken 2 years to feel the full force of what is going on in Syria, and the worst may yet lie ahead for Lebanon. The country has had to absorb well over 1 million refugees, some say it may be closer to 2 million, in a population estimated at some 4 million people. This is a burden of biblical proportions for so small and fragile a country, whose infrastructure is already inadequate and stretched to its limits. According to the World Bank, the refugee influx has cost Lebanon some $2.6 billion in lost expenditures and extra expenditures since the outbreak of the uprising in Syria. On top of this, Syria is Lebanon's sole land outlet to the Middle East, and the conflict has substantially impacted on overland trade. While the activities of the Beirut port have expanded, they have not compensated for the very negative repercussions of the Syrian conflict on Lebanon in general. The tourism sector, as some of you may know, a vital sector for the Lebanese economy, has suffered greatly from 3 consecutive washout summer seasons due to the conflict, and the decision of governments in the Gulf countries to discourage their citizens from traveling to Lebanon. Construction has also taken a hit, even if you may not notice that upon landing in Beirut. Bank deposits continue to rise, but it is essential that they continue to rise in the future, because the banks are the backbone of the Lebanese economy. If they do not buy treasury bills, the Lebanese government cannot finance its expenditures. But of course, the banking system is reliant on the economy, which is going through a very shaky and a very difficult period now. Politically, the country has been greatly affected, of course, by the rising sectarianism in Syria, which reflects the sectarian mosaic in Lebanon. From the outset of the fighting, Lebanon's Sunnis, in their majority, not all, but in their majority, have sided with the opposition in Syria, while the Shia community, led by Hezbollah, has backed the Syrian regime. Hezbollah has had three principal fears in Syria, explaining its behavior. First of all, that an Assad defeat in Syria would deny the party its strategic depth in the event of a conflict with Israel. And more importantly, that it would deny Iran, Hezbollah's patron, a strategic ally in the Levant. Secondly, that an Assad defeat would give Hezbollah's rivals in Lebanon, particularly the Sunni majority Future movement, the leverage they need to force the party into a process that would eventually lead to its disarmament and weakening, a process of disarmament that would weaken the party ultimately. Without its weapons, Hezbollah would not be Hezbollah. And again, Iran would lose a prominent ally in the Levant. A third reason is that a Sunni victory in Syria would threaten to break this so-called Shia arc that stretches from Iran to Lebanon via Iraq and Syria. Having said that, I tend to disagree with the notion that the Alawis are Shia. I mean, this has been sort of a sleight of hand that is taken in terms of commentary on the Syrian crisis that has sort of become accepted. I don't believe they're Shia, but I believe today that their interests are very much parallel. And so the fear of Hezbollah is that this sort of linkage that would tie them would be broken, and that, in a sense, the community, the Shia community in Lebanon, would be vulnerable to the Sunni majority in the neighborhood, in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and the Palestinian areas. For the party, this feeling was compounded by a belief that the Arab uprisings ultimately benefited Sunni Islamist groups, whose interests were very different than Hezbollah's. The party did not want to have to deal with this phenomenon in Lebanon and in Syria. Sunni support for the Syrian opposition, in turn, has been more disorganized than Hezbollah's on behalf of the regime. Lebanese Sunni combatants have gone to fight in Syria, though it's not clear how many. Arms have crossed the Lebanese border into Syria, which is why the regime and Hezbollah were so keen to dislodge rebels from the area of Qusair, west of Homs, between Homs and the Lebanese border several months ago. The Sunni town of Arsal in the Bekaa Valley has also been used as a transit point for combatants and weapons. And that is why it has become a frequent target of attack by the Syrian regime's forces. And last year, the former Lebanese Prime Minister Saad Hariri appointed one of his parliamentarians, Aqab Sa'ar, to a military committee in Turkey that was coordinating assistance to the Syrian rebels. Clearly, they were working on behalf of the Saudis. This created a bit of a scandal in Lebanon, but I think it's true, denials on the part of the Hariri people, but I believe it's correct. The sectarian repercussions of the Syrian uprising were inevitable from the moment the Assad regime began to brutally repress the demonstrations of 2011, relying on the Alawi core of the security and intelligence apparatus to take the lead in doing so, and keeping Sunni military units on the sidelines when desertions began in the army. Moreover, in certain places such as Tel Kalakh near the northern Lebanese border, there were early efforts to empty Sunni villages and in that way break the Sunni nexus stretching from northern Lebanon into Syria. To many, the calculations behind such moves were sectarian, a process that continued in the area of Homs later on. As the polarization and violence grew, the sectarian nature of the conflict took on greater momentum, often exacerbated by the Syrian regime, which understood two things. First, that by encouraging a resort to the Sunni identity in the revolt would attract Sunni extremists, allowing the regime to say that it was fighting an extremist onslaught. In other words, the regime transformed what had been a bogus claim that it was fighting extremists into a self-fulfilling prophecy a year and a half to 2 years later. And secondly, the greater sectarianism allowed the Syrian regime to heighten the solidarity of Syria's minorities with the regime. The Alawis above all, but also the Christians and the Druze to a certain extent, and the Shia community, the small Shia community in Syria, so that these minorities would side with the regime. So it essentially created very clear alignments that allowed it to reinforce its position. This cynical game had far-reaching repercussions in Lebanon, itself racked by Sunni-Shia tensions since the assassination of Rafiq Hariri in February 2005, an operation in which both Syria and Hezbollah were very likely involved. There was very real fear earlier this year that the Sunni-Shia tensions would get out of control, though that did not happen. I think it didn't happen for two primary reasons. First of all, because the Sunni groups remain poorly trained, armed, and organized, and do not have the financial and logistical means to challenge Hezbollah. Moreover, the Lebanese army, over which Hezbollah has significant influence, has managed to contain the threat of armed conflict, frequently acting decisively against Sunni armed groups. This has alienated the more radical groups from the military establishment, but in general, the Sunni community, like any community in Lebanon, has been happy to stay away from the prospect of war. At a broader level, beyond Syria, how were the revolts in the Arab world perceived in Lebanon? Initially, the uprisings against Ben Ali rule in Tunisia and Mubarak rule in Egypt were welcomed by Iran and by its allies in Syria and Hezbollah as being setbacks for the United States. The irony is that the Sunni Arab world and Sunnis in general welcomed the uprisings almost as intensely, interpreting this as a fundamental shift in the Middle East away from despotic rule. By this, of course, I mean the societies rather than the governments. There is no need to remind you that the Saudi regime, for example, considered Mubarak a strategic ally and considered America's decision to abandon Mubarak as basically a betrayal. With the Libyan conflict, the cross-sectarian appeal was reinforced, as most Sunnis, like the Shias who blamed the Gaddafi regime for the disappearance of the Imam Musa Sadr, the Lebanese Shia leader in the 1970s, most Sunnis also considered Gaddafi a thug. I remind you that in 2003, the Saudis accused Gaddafi of organizing an assassination plot against, at the time, Crown Prince Abdullah, today King Abdullah. It is only the outbreak of the uprising in Syria that complicated this picture, as it threatened to shift the balance of power in the Levant and the eastern part of the Arab world. As Egypt and Tunisia appeared to fall under the sway of Sunni Islamists, Iran and Hezbollah, as well as Syria and further afield Russia, saw the emergence of a potentially threatening phenomenon, radical Islam. No matter how much they welcomed American setbacks, they did not want a Sunni Islamist wave in their part of the Arab world that might turn against them. The so-called resistance axis of Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, and Hamas was especially vulnerable for being perceived as an Iranian-led coalition. The pressure on Hamas to abandon its relationship with Iran and the Syrian regime increased dramatically as sectarian polarization and violence in Syria escalated. And as an alternative ally emerged in Egypt, an alternative ally of Hamas emerged in Egypt, until finally Hamas did take its distance from the Syrian regime. The challenge directed against the Assad regime was a direct threat against the so-called resistance axis, especially in 2011-2012, and pushed Hezbollah into deploying its combatants to defend the Syrian regime, making its fealty to Iran evident. Worse, Hezbollah initially justified the risky move on sectarian grounds, as defense of the Shia in Syria, undermining a main premise of its previous appeal, that it was an Arab, not a Shia resistance movement, and in its identity a revolutionary force focused on defending against Israel and the US. The party did readjust later on, but just again to remind you that initially, several months ago, when Nasrallah had to explain why Shia fighters had entered into the area near Homs, he defended it on sectarian grounds, saying there are Shia Lebanese villages in Syrian territory. They have a bit of an ambiguous identity, who Hezbollah was defending. And of course, Hezbollah combatants are near the Sayyidat Zainab Mosque in Damascus, along with their Iraqi brethren. The message here has been very clearly a sectarian message, much more than a political one. Instead, what many saw was that Hezbollah's intervention was part of a broader Shia Alawi-dominated coalition under Iranian guidance, dead set on protecting a minority regime in Syria. Hezbollah, the once revolutionary force that had denounced in its rhetoric the sectarian Lebanese system, was now showing its true colors as a profoundly counter-revolutionary sectarian organization. Similarly, the party that had claimed to speak for the deprived was behaving as the hammer of a regime that was slaughtering Syria's deprived in the thousands, the tens of thousands. In other words, all the masks fell in Syria, masks that Hezbollah had worked hard to sustain for decades and around which it had built its public identity in the Arab world. Iran, too, whose revolutionary legitimacy was predicated on the overthrow of the authoritarian regime of the Shah that had used violence against Iranian protesters in the late 1970s, was now helping crush an uprising against the dictator and even looking the other way on his use of chemical weapons, from which Iran had suffered in its war against Saddam Hussein. These contradictions, while they could be managed by the so-called resistance axis, also eroded its legitimacy throughout the region because of the sectarianism at the heart of the confrontation between the Arabs and Iran. Machiavelli had replaced Abdel Nasser as Iran and Hezbollah, formerly implicit supporters of the Arab nationalist impulse against America and Israeli power, now used armed force and money to sustain Iranian interest in the Arab world. Ironically, Arab states objectively found themselves on the same side as Israel in viewing Iran as the main regional threat. Arab countries, rather than being fertile ground for Iranian and Hezbollah's anti-Western ideology and message, saw both as a mortal threat. And nowhere was this as hard-edged as in Lebanon. The Syria war shifted Hezbollah's priorities away from fighting Israel to defending its Syrian ally. The US opening to Iran by lowering the likelihood of a US-Iranian conflict has bought the party valuable breathing room to pursue its Syria campaign. So just to conclude briefly by saying a few things on Lebanon. First, I'd like to say that Lebanon today is nowhere near out of the woods. As the situation in Syria fluctuates, Lebanon will be kept perilously on hold, riven by its internal divisions, waiting to see what happens. If we can avoid armed conflict and economic collapse, or economic collapse, then those alone would be major achievements. We're a country without a government that has postponed parliamentary elections that were scheduled this year, a country in limbo, facing major social and economic difficulties as the Syrian conflict grinds on. I'm particularly worried about the refugee issue, which could have a profound bearing on our own fragile demographics. Most of the Syrian refugees are Sunnis from areas such as Homs that are strategic to the Alawi regime. Their return home is unlikely anytime soon, and so they will remain in Lebanon, threatening to become long-term refugees, helping further import Syria's contradictions into Lebanon. Like the Palestinian refugees of 1948, their presence may emerge as one the Lebanese cannot properly or adequately manage or absorb. This represents to me among the most serious challenges to the country that already has far too many challenges to deal with. What about prospects for the future in the region? I'd like to look more broadly at the region and highlight a few points that I believe we should watch for in the future, thanks to the Arab uprisings. The first thing I'd like to say is that the idea of revolution, which had created such enthusiasm 2-3 years ago, no longer has the appeal it had. The revolutionary ideal to many Arabs has disappeared amid chaos and a desire to return to stability and order. And this is worrisome to anybody who desires change in the Arab world. I've always been opposed to the notion that democracy must somehow be weighed against an undemocratic stability. Either one or the other, but I recognize that among many Arabs this has become common. In all the places that overthrew their leaders, the post-revolutionary phase brought turmoil, though the reasons for this varied from one country to the other, so it's perhaps not useful to generalize. And yet this perception of widespread instability and failure may push the Egyptian people to welcome a new autocrat next year in the person of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. In Syria, it has pushed probably a majority to regret the militarization of the uprising, making them objectively more amenable to a continuation of Assad rule, even if he and his regime have behaved in the most barbaric way. Again, let me insist that I'm not advocating this view. I'm simply reporting what I'm seeing around me. Societies crave order, and the Arab dictators or militaries understood this from the outset and manipulated this desire to thwart the demands of the masses in their countries. In Egypt, the military played on the resentment of Mohammed Morsi to maneuver back into a position of power. In Libya and Syria, the rulers initiated bloody civil wars to show the population the prohibitive price of change. In one case, it failed in Libya. In the second, Syria, it appears to be working. Because, of course, what is the one thing the regimes want above all? It's survival. That's their ultimate objective, political survival. Only in Tunisia do we seem to have a relatively more civil transition, despite the assassinations in the country and the ongoing disagreement over the role of Islamism and secularism in the post-revolutionary society. The second observation is that the Arab uprisings, which should have represented a moment of opportunity for the democratic West, have instead illustrated their differing agendas and contradictions and their ineffectiveness. While the UK, France, and the United States were on the same side in Libya and Egypt and were successful for being so, in Syria they have been utterly helpless, often pursuing policies that they could not sustain, making commitments and promises they could not keep or would not keep. In this, the United States has had a special place of honor, or shall I say dishonor. The Obama administration has behaved with astonishing short-sightedness in Syria, as if it had no stake in the strategic outcome of the conflict there. How odd, considering that its main regional rival, Iran, reached precisely the contrary conclusion and put all its effort in ensuring that Assad would remain in office. One can understand that Obama does not want to spend another decade mired in the Middle East, but unfortunately foreign policy is not a menu to pick and choose from. Opportunities are created and must be exploited. Syria, to my mind, was such a place. An American hesitation and its refusal to help accelerate Assad's downfall in 2011, 2012 gave Iran valuable breathing space to help Assad regroup and facilitated the emergence of the very jihadists that the US had warned against, who saw a golden opportunity for their endeavors amidst the Syrian population abandoned by all. Today, there's a new illusion, and it's called Geneva II. And while we can all welcome diplomacy over Syria, unfortunately, the parties' different conditions for holding the conference appear, to my mind, irreconcilable. Without a military advantage on the ground, whoever amongst the Syrian parties goes to Geneva will likely see a military disadvantage translated into a political disadvantage. Most remarkably, the US has regarded Russia as a friendly partner in the process. But Vladimir Putin's Russia has been realist to the core, playing power politics in a way that Obama, who we once heard was himself a realist, has utterly avoided playing. Will the US-Russian partnership lead anywhere good? I believe that if Russia opts to present himself as a candidate for Syria's presidency next year, the conflict will be indefinitely prolonged, as the Saudis double up to organize and arm the rebellion. Here, Russia may have a role to play in pushing for a transition away from Assad. The US must use all its political weight to try to bring this about, but I have no real hope that it will. With Obama weakened politically at home, I don't see the president taking risks over Syria, especially after he was so roundly rebuffed following the chemical attack a few months ago by the Assad regime. And finally, I wonder what the Arab uprisings tell us about democracy in general in the Middle East. The democratic moment that we saw in 2011 has dissolved into a maelstrom of very different, very depressing dynamics. Some have interpreted this optimistically as inevitable turbulence on the path towards a better future. Perhaps, but I think at best the picture is more mixed than that. The outcome in Tunisia may ultimately be a better one. In Egypt, I'm not sure if the interregnum will reinforce democratic rule, when many Egyptians still interpret the military coup that removed Morsi as the fruit of a democratic popular will. I don't need to remind you the number of countries in the 20th century, including Egypt, where autocrats were brought to power on a wave of popular acclamation. In Libya and Syria, the levels of violence have certainly made much more difficult, if not impossible, the kinds of democratic outcomes that we once hoped for. I believe that Assad, whatever his army's successes here and there, will face an unstable country for years to come. Syria's conflict may morph into other conflicts in the future, as was the case in Lebanon. Whether he can survive this in the long term is anybody's guess, but meanwhile, Syria will remain a dysfunctional regional playing field, as it was in the past, bleeding the resources of all regional parties, not to say bleeding the Syrians themselves. And to come full circle to Lebanon, a country that is great, that is partly democratic, how will it navigate through the rough seas ahead? Never underestimate the capacity of weak, therefore necessarily flexible, countries to survive or evade the worst outcomes. But any notion that Lebanon may be used as a model of institutionalized sectarian coexistence in Syria seems very distant to me. I don't believe in the present context there can be a Ta'if agreement for Syria, by which I mean a regionally sponsored accord that imposes a new power-sharing arrangement formula for power in Syria. But Lebanon may serve as a model in another respect. In the past 2 years, I have often heard that a new Arab world is being born, not in the idealistic sense, but one in which states will fragment into separate sectarian and ethnic entities. Yet I recall that despite 15 years of war in Lebanon and ample predictions of partition, the country never broke up. That same impulse, I believe, exists in Syria. The Assad regime, as an extension of its totalistic tendencies, wants to control all of Syria in order to preserve and secure Assad rule. In fact, I don't believe that the Assads would survive the establishment of an Alawi mini-state. I think they would be removed very quickly. Similarly, the Syrian rebels have no interest in creating small entities of their own, since they have portrayed their struggle as a nationalistic endeavor. This absolute, to reimpose one state on all, will persist, and the state will remain the be-all and end-all of political action. And yet Arabs revolted precisely because their states were failing. Until Arab revolutionaries can recast their states democratically and transform them into entities that serve and speak to the needs of their societies, we will have achieved nothing in the Middle East. The Arab Spring will have achieved nothing. And people like me will continue to come before you with tales of regret for what might have been. Thank you.